Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. My name is Stephen Bliss. I'm Director of Strategic Communications at the California Budget and Policy Center, and we're pleased to have you on today's webinar, joining us to hear our briefing on the Governor's proposed 2017-18 state budget. We'll be presenting highlights from our first look analysis of the state budget, and you'll have a chance to ask questions of our expert panel and discuss some of the key elements of the state budget and what they mean for California and communities across the state. So with that, I'm happy to turn things over to Chris Haney, Executive Director, who will get things started. Chris.
Great, thank you, Stephen, and welcome everyone to our briefing on the Governor's proposed 2017-18 state budget. This is our first look analysis that we're going to share with you today, and we're delighted to be able to be doing this webinar with you. It's the first event in our new Policy Perspective speaker series, a series of online and in-person events that we'll be conducting throughout the year. So please watch for announcements of future webinar briefings that we'll be doing and events that we'll be coordinating and announcing around the state in the months to come. You'll see a hashtag here, hashtag Policy Perspectives. So for those of you that are participating in social media today and want to tweet about the presentation, please use the hashtag, and we'll be doing so from @CalBudgetCenter, which you can use as well as you feel appropriate. So for our presentation today, I'm going to start it off by providing an overview of the Governor's budget proposal. My presentation will in part be based on the Budget Center's first look analysis, which we released last week after the budget was released by the Governor, and that we sent out to our list, and it's available on the front page of our website at calbudgetcenter.org. My colleagues pictured here, Alyssa Anderson, Senior Policy Analyst, Scott Graves, Director of Research, Jonathan Kaplan, Senior Policy Analyst, and Kristen Schumacher, Policy Analyst, will join me in this discussion today, providing further insights and particularly participating in the question and discussion section of the webinar to provide further detail and outlines of the Governor's budget as needed. So let's talk about the Governor's budget in terms of top lines and key context. As we noted in our first look analysis, the defining theme in this year's budget proposal is uncertainty stemming from the unknowns about what will be coming at California from the federal government and what the economic and fiscal outlook looks like for the state of California, two major external forces that will determine what the state spending plan looks like and what the underlying context is as we proceed in the next couple of months. That budget work that's going to happen in the months to come is going to sit amid some pretty significant context, as we've noted here, in terms of those external forces. So you have several major considerations, most notably something that's probably on many of your minds, the prospect of likely cuts and changes at the federal level with the Trump administration and a Republican Congress. Foremost among those is the debate about the repeal and replace, or whatever that might look like, of the Federal Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's sometimes referred to, including Medicaid, or as we call it in California, Medi-Cal expansion, and what potential cuts or reforms might mean for California and its state budget. The other major external force here is state revenues and what's happening with the national economy and California's economy. The Governor's budget proposal is framed by, in particular, lower than expected revenues that have come in recent months, and being cautious about state revenues going forward. And so the combination of those forces results in a very conservative state budget proposal, at least as it's currently structured. Of course, the other context there in terms of the state budget is the needs and demands in terms of California's communities and its people and its own economic future. And in that regard, we know that coming out of the Great Recession, we have many key public services and supports that are still operating at severely diminished levels. And we'll talk about some of those in terms of the presentation that's coming in a few minutes. But in particular, any further potential cuts at the federal level and what those might mean for vulnerable populations in California means that there needs to be some sort of a state response in order to help those who are in need of greater assistance from the state. And of course, the other issue is about economic hardship overall. We know that overall poverty rates in California are high, particularly if we adjust for costs such as housing. Child poverty rates are high as well. And that many regions of the state haven't experienced the sort of economic growth and recovery from the recession that is often reported in terms of the overall aggregate state numbers. And all of that means, in terms of this underlying context, that state leaders, regardless of what they're confronting at the federal level, are looking for ways to still make progress, like the progress that's been made in recent years' budgets in terms of trying to expand things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, or increase child care slots, or provide public assistance through various safety net programs. So that's the underlying context for the state budget. Let's talk a little bit about the top lines, the sort of quick summary of what the governor's budget proposal looks like. The first thing to note there is that there isn't much in the state budget that talks about the potential federal policy changes. Not knowing more about what's coming from the federal government, the governor's budget assumes current federal policies continue as they're currently structured, and assumes funding levels continue as they otherwise would. So, for example, that means no changes are assumed within the Affordable Care Act and the funding levels coming from the federal government. Key to this year's budget is what's happening with revenues. The governor's forecast is that revenues over the 3-year budget window are nearly $6 billion lower than previously projected. It's important to remember here that the state budget, or any state budget proposal, actually is looking at 3 fiscal years. The prior fiscal year, in this case 2015-16, the current fiscal year in which we're operating, 2016-17, and the next fiscal year for 2017-18. And so across that window, the governor is saying that revenues are coming in $5.8 billion lower than projected. For 2017-18, those revenues, combined with some other factors on the spending side, result in the governor projecting a $1.6 billion shortfall absent other actions. And we're going to talk about some of those actions that the governor proposes them here in a few minutes. The long and short of that is, if you're facing a projected budget deficit, as the governor's budget proposed, you then restrain spending, and this governor's proposal contains no new investments in many of the key services that help families make ends meet in advance, and we'll talk some more about some of those details here shortly. And lastly, in terms of a summary of what's in the governor's budget, many of you who have been observing and watching and advocating around the state budget will know that the governor has prioritized in recent years the building up of state reserves, or rainy day funds, and paying down state debts. And so this budget continues that trend, both in terms of constitutional requirements and in some optional allocations, and we'll outline those for you shortly here as well. So let's start by looking at what's underlying the state budget in terms of the economic outlook and what that means for revenue projections. The administration expects economic growth to continue, but points to some risks. And one of the things I want to stress here is that the governor's proposal is not suggesting that there is an economic decline. It's merely suggesting that the economy isn't growing as fast as had been expected. So in other words, growth is slowing, but there is still growth. And the administration is assuming moderate rates of growth will continue over the next few years. The administration notes there are several risks. What happens with the national economy, of course, the potential impacts of federal changes on that economy, and California's own ongoing housing crisis and what that means for the state economy are all concerns the governor raises. And the governor, as he has done in recent budget years, was consistent in noting that economic expansions can't last forever. But as the legislative analyst office has noted in their own forecast for the state budget, expansions don't necessarily die of old age, and we don't necessarily have a set of indicators at the moment that are suggesting we're headed toward recession. We're just merely in a period where mature economic growth is resulting in a sort of slowdown in that rate of growth. What that means for the revenue outlook is lower than expected revenues, and when combined with some other increasing costs, most particularly on the Medi-Cal front, the governor suggests we'll be facing a $1.6 billion shortfall and a series of actions to try and address that. I'd note here again that the Legislative Analyst's Office projections are considerably more optimistic than the governor's. Both the Department of Finance for the governor and the Legislative Analyst's Office make conservative projections about the state budget, but in this case the LAO's forecast is more optimistic than the Department of Finance. It's always difficult to forecast state revenues for a fiscal year that starts 6 months from now, and so we're going to know a lot more about what that revenue outlook will look like as the next few months revenue collections come in. So this is an issue to watch as we move from now to the governor's revision of his budget in May. In particular, what happens with those revenue collections and what happens with the national and the state economy. So let's talk about some of the specific elements of the governor's proposed budget. Let's start with the issue that I'm sure is on many people's minds, which is the proposed potential changes to the Affordable Care Act. The governor did note and has noted that the budget emphasizes uncertainty as the fate of the Affordable Care Act proceeds at the federal level. It's important to back up and sort of note what the Affordable Care Act has meant for California. Under the ACA, state policymakers have expanded health care coverage and cut the state's uninsured rate in half through two mechanisms. The first is the expansion of Medicaid, or Medi-Cal in California, expanding the coverage to low-income adults under 65 who were previously excluded. We are covering approximately 4 million Californians that way, and the federal government reimburses California for the vast majority of those costs of expansion. The other way we're covering people through the Affordable Care Act is federal subsidies for private coverage through California's online health exchange, Covered California. We're covering about 1 million people that way. The full repeal of the Affordable Care Act would have a potential budgetary impact on California of over $20 billion each year. So we're talking about a very significant potential hit to the state through full repeal, or if there's some partial repeal and reform that takes place, still a significant hit in terms of the scale of budget proposals. Those of you who have watched state budget proposals over the years will know that oftentimes when we get into that May and June period where we're getting near to an enacted budget, those final debates and deliberations are often about allocations in the several $100 million range or $1 billion at most. So the potential hit of somewhere between $0 and $20 billion is such that will make many policymakers in the coming weeks and months be very conservative about what they're committing to the state to as they try to assess what's happening at the federal level. While we're talking about healthcare and Medi-Cal, we should talk about the impacts of Proposition 56, which was passed this last November, an increase in the state's tobacco tax. The governor's budget proposal projects that that increase will actually provide $1.7 billion this coming year, and the administration allocates most of this amount, $1.2 billion, to new Medi-Cal costs that are coming from the expansion of costs in that program. And so most of this money then goes into the Medi-Cal arena. Those of you who are seasoned budget watchers will also know that the governor's heavy priority in recent budget years has been the building up of state reserves, or rainy day funds, as we often call them. There are two funds here that we want to talk about. In 2014, via voter approval of Proposition 2, the state revised its constitutionally required rainy day fund, technically called the Budget Stabilization Account, requiring that 1.5% of the general fund be set aside, and that requiring that when capital gains exceed 8% of the general fund, that the excess is also set aside. Up through 2030, a half of those funds will go into the Budget Stabilization Account, and then a half are required to be set aside for paying down budgetary debts, things such as state pension and health care costs for retirees and employees. For 2017 and 18, the Proposition 2 set aside into the Budget Stabilization Account would be $1.2 billion. and similarly, a $1.2 billion would be set aside for budgetary debts. That would bring the budget stabilization account total to $7.9 billion by the close of the 2017-18 fiscal year. The state also has another reserve account called the Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties, and the governor proposes $1.6 billion be set aside in this fund. So when you add the two together, the rainy day fund or the budget stabilization account and this Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties, the total set aside in reserves is $9.5 billion for 2017 and 18. So let's talk a little bit about the issue of this $1.6 billion projected deficit, because a projected deficit, as the governor's proposal notes, then is pending other federal actions or other, state actions. So let's talk a little bit about how the governor talks about closing that gap. The governor's proposed budget would rescind certain one-year commitments that were part of last summer's budget agreement. The most notable ones here include funds for affordable housing, funds that were set aside in the 2016-17 budget agreement pending resolution with the state legislature about streamlining the allocation of those funds, a resolution that wasn't met, and so the governor is proposing to rescind that $400 million. Another $300 million in renovating and replacing state office buildings, another piece that was set aside in the 16-17 budget agreement, and then a housing and disability program that was established for this year's budget to aid people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness and who have a disability in accessing needed benefits. So these were intended one-time investments from the 2016-17 budget agreement that the governor is pulling back on for the 2017-18 budget. Another way that the governor is proposing to close the budget deficit that he's projecting is by pausing or delaying a multi-year plan that was agreed to with the legislature in 2016 to reinvest in the state's child care and development system by increasing the number of slots available and increasing provider rates. The agreement and the spending required would now be delayed until the 2018-19 fiscal year via this pause or this delay. It's important to note that the extent to which the state is operating below capacity in the systems, California, even with some recent years increases, has approximately 70,000 fewer slots in the system available than prior to the Great Recession. And via some analysis that we've done recently, we know that about 1.2 million of those who are eligible are not receiving the benefits, or about 6 in 7. So we have a large and pent-up unmet need in this arena where the pausing of investments and the inability to build back from what was cut previously continues to be an ongoing gap in terms of the state's investments. One of the more troubling proposals in the governor's budget is a shift of additional in-home support service costs to counties. There are not a lot of details. If you've looked at the governor's budget on this, we'll talk through it in brief here and maybe something we come back to. But this would happen through the discontinuation of a coordinated care initiative, an initiative that seeks to integrate health care and other services, including IHSS, and that under current law is actually scheduled to end in 2017-18. The administration's proposal has determined that the coordinated care initiative is not cost effective, and so according to pursuant law, it would actually allow the initiative to end. This has particularly problematic implications for IHSS and counties in that it would mean that the state would return to a prior funding formula for IHS that would increase the county's share of IHSS costs. The best estimate of this is that it would be an approximate $600 million ongoing annual cost shift from the state to counties. The governor's budget proposal does admit that counties lack sufficient funding to cover the increased share of the costs of IHSS and proposes to work with counties to mitigate the cost to the extent possible. What we don't know and what we need to watch for in the coming months is what mitigate means and whether there's some significant shift in IHSS costs to counties that becomes an ongoing shift to counties in terms of the costs and a savings to the state budget. And so that's something to watch in terms of the details and what that means going forward. And there are a number of other core elements about the state budget that we'll walk through in brief here. In light of lower revenues, we will see slowed growth in funding for K-12 education in community colleges via the state's Proposition 98 minimum guarantee for those systems. It's guaranteed, constitutionally set by a series of formulas, such that when revenues go up, the minimum guarantee increases, and when revenues go down or come in slower than expected, we receive decreased or slower than expected funding for these systems. So both of these systems reflect the change in the revenue projections. The proposed budget also continues some modest increases in CSU and UC funding, very similar to what the course that the governor's budget has taken in recent years, and reduces key student aid programs, most notably the middle class scholarship program, which it begins to phase out by not accepting any new students into the program for 2017-18. The budget also continues to support the new California Earned Income Tax Credit, which was implemented this last tax season for the first time, and it continues to support that via an allocation per the state budget, probably in the range, depending on EITC participation. The governor is estimating around $260 million in foregone revenues from claiming the Earned Income Tax Credit, and so the commitment to that credit that was enacted continues to go forward. In terms of other key public supports for low-income Californians, such as CalWORKS, our Welfare to Work program, and basic public assistance for seniors and people with disabilities, the budget deficit and the conservative budget proposal basically mean that there are no new investments in those programs. And much like the notes I had about the early education systems earlier, these are systems operating significantly below demand and capacity, and significantly below where they were prior to the Great Recession. There are a couple of other elements we wanted to talk about here quickly as well. The governor's proposed budget reflects some changes to state-run retirement systems. CalPERS, the state retirement system for public employees, and CalSTRS, the retirement system for teachers in California. The governor's budget reflects a recent change that was enacted by CalPERS, which lowers its discount rate. Discount rates are sort of complicated to explain. There's a lot of factors that go into them, but one easy way to think about them is this is CalPERS' expected rate of return on the investments that it makes, and when that rate of return goes down, the obligation from the state budget has to increase to make up for the lower rate of return. So CalPERS is predicting a 0.5% decrease in their discount rate, and therefore the state's budget, the governor's proposed budget, reflects increased commitments to cover that change. The governor's budget also assumes that CalSTRS will soon follow suit and reduce their discount rate by a similar level. Whether that happens is unknown, but the governor is assuming that in the state budget, and so accounting for additional contributions there as well. In terms of the state's newest retirement system, the Secure Choice program, which would provide a retirement system option for private sector workers who aren't offered insurance through their retirement through their workplace, the state provides a $15 million loan to the Secure Choice program for its initial implementation, and that will continue over the next couple of years. So that's the retirement system changes. In other news, in terms of state ballot measures, some of you will remember that California voters passed Proposition 57 in November, which instituted a series of criminal justice reforms, most notably that actually give the state more policy options in terms of reducing sentences in some way and reducing the prison population. The regulations about how that happens will be forthcoming. The governor's assuming savings from the measure will be about $22.4 million, increasing to $140 million by 2021. So that's the sort of effect of the new ballot measure in the criminal justice arena. And lastly, without going into too many details on this front, the governor is asking the legislature to approve a 10-year transportation funding package. This is a package the governor first proposed a couple of years ago. It has some slight revisions, but that's coming back this year. And he's also asking the legislature to reaffirm the cap and trade program, Both of these changes would likely require 2/3 votes of the state legislature in the transportation funding package, primarily because of a gas tax increase and in the cap and trade program because of wanting to make it so that the cap and trade fees that are instituted are safe and protected going forward. And so that's another area where you'll be seeing some coming work in the months ahead. So given all that, let's talk about what some of the major issues are to watch going forward. You've heard me mention a couple of these so far. First and foremost, of course, is what happens with federal actions. We're going to know a little bit more in the next couple of days, and we're certainly going to learn a lot more in the coming weeks and months about what the Trump administration proposes, what that means for the Affordable Care Act in particular, and there are other expected proposals coming later in the year around changes and potential cuts to things like the Food Assistance Program, or SNAP as it's called, CalFresh here in California, potential changes to SSI, SSP, and maybe some potential changes to the tax code federally that could affect California. So there's a lot in the federal arena to keep an eye on that could have major potential impacts on what the state's spending plan for next year looks like. And then, of course, we want to keep a close eye on the legislature's response. Do the Assembly and Senate leaders push for greater investment, particularly given affordable housing issues? There's certainly ways to expand the Cali ITC to be of more support to the state's large low-income population, and other supports for Californians who are still struggling to access economic opportunity. And then the increased funding for CSU and USC and UC that we've seen in recent years. So how the legislature responds and how those responses are affected by other external actions at the federal level certainly matter a great deal. And then the other external issue here, of course, is what happens with the economy? What's the revenue forecast look like? When we get to the May revision of the governor's proposed budget, and we've had a few more months of revenue collections, we know a little bit more about what the last quarter or so of the economy looks like. What does that do to his revenue forecast in May? In recent years, the governor has not budged very much on his revenue projections, but there's some thought that given the level of uncertainty about the economy, that if revenues were to increase more than anticipated, there might be additional space in the state budget. So those are sort of major issues to watch. We will be watching them closely and putting out analyses as we go. We have several pieces coming out in the next few days. But I'd encourage you to continue to engage with us. You can hear more about these issues, and we'll be digging into them in more detail at our upcoming annual policy conference, which is March 2nd in Sacramento. And you can see information here and on our website, so we'd love to see you here in Sacramento on March 2nd if you want to talk and hear more about these issues. And now we're going to transition to the Q&A, then the discussion period of this. I want to stress that we're still in the early stages of our analysis of the state budget. Our first look is out, and we're still learning more each day as we dig into the details as we get them. So we may not know all the answers to your questions, but we'll do our best to answer them here or to answer them offline if needed. You can type your questions into the chat box, and Stephen will say a little bit more about this, and then he's going to queue this up and we'll read the questions through. And my colleagues who you'll see pop up here on the screen will join us as needed, and we'll do our best to respond.
Thank you, Chris. This is Stephen Bliss again, and as Chris mentioned, we're going to move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. I see people starting to type in some questions and send them our way. And just as Chris had pointed out, on the GoToWebinar toolbar, which on many people's screens will be on your right, there's a questions field at the bottom of that, and just type in your question. That'll come right to us. I'll be sort of calling through those, and we'll pose them to the group. And along with Chris on the line, we also have Alyssa Anderson, Senior Policy Analyst, Scott Graves, Director of Research, Jonathan Kaplan, Senior Policy Analyst, and Kristen Schumacher, Policy Analyst, available to take your questions. I've also had a couple people email a few questions in as well, so we'll try to get to those. And so while people are sending in their questions, I want to start with one that came in via email, and this one probably goes to Alyssa, and it goes to the question of outreach for the California EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. And Alyssa, anything you can say about what we know about the importance of outreach to uptake for the EITC?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, as Chris said, the governor is proposing to maintain the credit exactly at the same size that's been provided in previous years since the credit was created. Last year's budget included $2 million to provide grants to community-based organizations and local government agencies to do education and outreach to boost participation in the credit, because it's a new credit and it's a credit that targets people with such low incomes. Most are not required to file their taxes, so it's a hard group to get to be aware of the credit. The governor is not proposing to provide additional dollars for outreach in this year's budget, but we would argue that it's really important for the state to continue providing support for outreach efforts to get the word out about the credit. We conducted a survey of over 900 clients at County Human Services offices this past fall. And just looking at people who were likely eligible for the Cal EITC, we found that fewer than 1 in 5 had actually heard of the credit. And on top of that, we found that fewer than half of those who were likely eligible for the Cal EITC actually filed their taxes in the first year that the credit was available. So potentially lots of people missed out on hundreds or even thousands of dollars in cash back, not just from the Cal EITC, but also from federal working family tax credits like the federal EITC. So all this is to say that we really think that outreach efforts need to be ongoing. And it's something that we'll be looking for to come up in the ongoing budget debate.
Great. Thank you, Alyssa. Again, keep sending your questions via the question box on the GoToWebinar. We have a number of questions already coming in, and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. Just as a quick note, and I think Chris may have mentioned this earlier as well, that the budget's been out for about 8 days, and so we're still kind of digging into it, and we'll be doing further analyses in the weeks and months to come. And what we're speaking to here is our first look analysis of the budget. So we'll try to get to as many of these questions as we can, sort of bearing that in mind. We have a question here about the revenue estimates, and also relatedly the economic outlook of the governor as compared to the LAO. And so the question goes to gain a little bit more detail on sort of how the governor's revenue projections and economic forecasts differ somewhat from the LAOs.
So maybe I'll start. Alyssa's joining here, and she can jump in as well. The LAO's analysis, which came out in November and which they update over time, was certainly more optimistic than the Department of Finance and the governor's estimates. That's been typical in recent years. We have noted in the work we've done that both organizations are diligent and responsible in the work that they do to try to forecast the revenues, so neither of them are sort of being wildly optimistic in their revenue projections, but there are differences. And the differences are significant in the sense of the budget's forecast from November showed there'd be several billion dollars in potential room for investments in 2017-18, and of course the governor's proposed budget's showing a projected deficit of $1.6 billion. Underlying this, as Alyssa's analysis has shown, is the economic outlook, the uncertainty, some revenue collections in recent months during this fiscal year that have been lower than projected. And I just come back to something I said earlier, which is to say that it's difficult to forecast what's going to happen with revenues 6 months before a fiscal year starts, and let alone for a fiscal year that's going to run 6 months to 18 months away. So it's just an issue to watch. Alyssa, did you want to add anything in terms of what we know on the details there? I think you're muted still too.
Sorry about that. So one of the questions I think was how the governor's revenues estimates compare to the LEO, and I was looking to see if I have it in front of me, and I don't. So that person can email us, and we can get that to you. But one thing I wanted to add to what Chris said is that the LEO's assessment of the governor's proposed budget, actually, it was interesting. They said that they thought that the governor's personal income tax revenue estimate seemed a bit too low. The governor is forecasting personal income tax revenues to grow by just over 3%. I think the LEO was a bit over 5%. And what the LEO points out is that this seems too low considering that personal income tax revenues have grown over 8% each year since the recession ended. And if you look back 20 years, we've typically seen personal income tax revenues grow much faster than what the governor is expecting. And on top of that, they said it seemed a little inconsistent with the governor's economic forecast, which was calling for, still strong gains in stock prices, for example, which affect capital gains income. So just to sort of reiterate what Chris emphasized is that we really won't have a clear picture of revenues until the May revision, which comes right after the personal income tax receipts will be in at the end of April.
Thank you, Alyssa and Chris. We have a question here that came in from the audience about corrections spending, and the question goes to sort of what is the top level trend on corrections, if we know that, and then also what we know at this point about the Prop 47 revenues and how that'll play out for the coming year.
Chris, you want me to take the lead on that?
Please do.
So a couple top line points here on correction spending. The first one is that the governor is projecting the state will spend just over $11 billion on the state correction system in the coming fiscal year. That's a little bit higher than they're estimating in the current fiscal year, but it's more or less stable from year to year because the governor also has a new proposal to shift some costs for psychiatric facilities or beds from the Department of State Hospitals to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So that results in an ongoing boost of $250 million for the Department of Corrections. That's not really new spending, though. That's just moving money around from one department to another. But it is important to point out that despite the fact that the state has significantly reduced the number of adults incarcerated at the state level over the last several years, we're still spending substantially more than $10 billion per year in general fund revenues on our state's correction system. Now, Prop 57, which we might talk about in a bit if anyone has questions, does hold the promise of reducing the number of adults in state institutions by almost 10,000 over the next few years, with savings of more than $100 million per year, according to administration estimates. But that's still relatively small. I'm not going to call it a drop in the bucket, but saving $100 million per year, it's better than nothing. But when you're already spending more than $10 billion on a vast infrastructure that's composed of 34 state prisons, we still have clearly a longer way to go here to really get this under control. Then in terms of Proposition 47, this was the measure passed by the voters a couple of years ago, which converts some offenses that were previously felonies to misdemeanors. It has resulted in a decline in the state's prison population. The Department of Finance is required by the measure to estimate the savings to the state each year. They did it for the first time last year. The savings that the department estimated were substantially lower than had been anticipated, around $39 million for the last fiscal year. The administration's current estimate for Prop 47 savings is just a little bit higher. I think it's around $42 million for this fiscal year. If that number sticks, and it could change by May, that means there would be just around $40 million, maybe a little bit more, to use for some of the rehabilitative services that were envisioned through Proposition 47 in the coming fiscal year. That's much less than the $100 to $200 million per year that was anticipated when voters passed the measure back in 2014.
Thank you, Scott. The number of questions coming in, we'll try to get to as many as we can, of course, but thanks for all the great questions. There's a number of questions here perhaps as would be expected about what the governor is describing as the shortfall this year, and it goes to the fact of the number of revenue measures having been approved, Prop 55 extending the higher income tax rates, from Prop 30 being approved last November, also as Chris mentioned earlier, the Prop 56 tobacco tax, and then also not a revenue measure per se, but the additional revenue from the legalization of marijuana for recreational use in our state. So a couple of people asking about, as sort of a top lines, how it is that with these sort of revenue conducive ballot measures from last year, how it is that even in light of those, we're still looking at a deficit for this year, or an apparent deficit for this year.
Right. So I'll start here. The first and most notable thing to say about this is that the Proposition 55 extension of the income tax rate increases that were passed by Proposition 30 in 2012 extends those income tax rate increases from 2018 to 2030. So the 2017-18 budget would already account for those income tax rate increases. So the effects of Proposition 55 are largely beyond the fiscal year that we're talking about right now. It certainly helps stabilize the state's outlook in terms of knowing what's coming in future years, but it wouldn't have an impact per se on the actual 2017-18 projections. I'll let Scott speak to the Proposition 56 tobacco tax issue, which I covered a little bit in brief, but Scott, you want to say a bit more?
Sure. So Proposition 56, the governor is estimating over the next 5 quarters would raise around $1.2 billion that would be allocated to Medi-Cal, and those dollars would be used to fund new growth in the program. So the governor is not proposing to use that $1.2 billion to fund any new policy initiatives within Medi-Cal or to fund, for example, increased payment rates for doctors and other providers in Medi-Cal. So it's strictly a way of allowing the state to meet increased costs within Medi-Cal without having to use $1.2 billion in general fund dollars to meet those costs. So it does provide a way for the state to continue to grow the Medi-Cal program, so to speak, without committing general fund revenues to do so.
And real quick, just on the marijuana legalization and the taxes that come with that. We're not experts on those issues, but what we do know about them is that the phase-in of the implementation of the legalization, a full legalization, happens over a several-year period. So while there was a projected revenue intake of over $1 billion from the full legalization of marijuana, the revenues to the state, and there's also an element of that that's revenues to local governments that choose to tax the sale of marijuana, those revenues wouldn't necessarily be realized yet in terms of, in any significant way in terms of the state budget for 2017-18.
We have another question that came in from the audience, and just as a quick sort of time check and a reminder, we're slated to go till 2 o'clock with the webinar, so we appreciate all the great questions. We have about 15 minutes to go, so if there's something that you want to make sure we try to address as part of this time, feel free to put that into the question pane on GoToWebinar. We have a question here for Kristen about ECE and childcare support in particular. It mentions our recent analysis from Kristen showing the shortage of subsidized childcare in our state and the number of slots that we're short on that. And the question goes to, in light, not just the pause that Chris mentioned, but also given the fact that the state is taking a sort of tempered view, what are we looking for from the federal level, or what are some of the things that we might be seeing that could even put more of a challenge in front of our state in terms of child care proposals that might be coming down the pike at the federal level in the coming days and weeks and months?
Sure. So as Chris mentioned, the 17-18 proposed budget actually pauses the reinvestments that were planned for the 17-18 fiscal year, that being a boost to the standard reimbursement rate, which is a provider payment rate for providers that contract directly with the state, and then also a small number of slots for the state preschool program. It does not include any additional funds for additional slots. President-elect Trump actually has a child care plan to help families afford the high cost of care, but that plan is focused on tax rebates and tax deductions, which doesn't really help families that are really struggling on a day-to-day basis to make ends meet and pay for child care. And so I don't expect a large boost to CCDBG funding, which is the main funding stream for subsidized child care in California, unfortunately.
Thank you. The next question is about education spending. It does, like some of the earlier questions, reference the some of the ballot measures, in particular Prop 55. And the question really gets to wanting to know a little bit more in detail about what Prop 98 currently looks like under the governor's proposal. And also it asks about the relative split between the K-12 side of Prop 98 and the community colleges side of 98. That's a question that would go to Jonathan Kaplan, I would think.
Yeah, so as relates to how the budget is proposing Prop 98 funding, as Chris mentioned in the intro, there is a slowing of growth in the 98 guarantee as we're moving into 2017-18. That change simply means that there is going to be slightly less funding in the 2016-17 year, the current year, than there was projected at the Budget Act in June of last year, but it is down by about $500 million in that period of time. In terms of the split between K-12 and community colleges, over the last several years, the split has been roughly in the 89% to the 89% range for K-12 schools. There's been slight variance there, but it's basically in that general range, and there isn't a market difference in terms of the split between K-12 and community colleges in the budget in the proposed budget.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. We have a question here about climate change, and it's sort of a general question just about what we expect in terms of where the governor proposes to go on climate change in particular, and especially in light of the fact that it seems as though our state is sort of positioned to push back a little bit on the federal government, or to go a little bit further than the federal government might be looking to go, especially in light of what we know about some of the cabinet appointments thus far from President-elect Trump. But the question wanted to know a little bit more about when the governor is talking about having the legislature affirm the cap and trade program, what is it that he's looking for from the legislature?
So this is an area that we haven't dug into yet in great detail, but let me at least just describe some of what the conjecture is that's out there for why this affirmation of the cap and trade program is needed. It seems as though there are sort of two explanations for that. One is that the cap and trade revenues come from the series of fees that are imposed, and there's been some recent challenges that those fees would have required a 2/3 vote to be legal in the state of California, and so the reaffirmation with a 2/3 vote in the state legislature would protect the cap and trade system as it's currently structured. That's at a pretty general level, so I apologize for not having further details, but that's one issue. I think the question from the participant here also goes to the second issue, which is whatever potential challenges are coming on the climate change front from the Trump administration and what those mean or imply for the state of California, and therefore by affirming the cap and trade system, sort of propping up its structure and protecting it against some other potential challenges that could come at it. Another reason connected to both of these is about ensuring that the program is producing the level of activity that's expected. So if you followed the cap and trade developments in its early years here, you'll note that the proceeds from the auctions in the cap and trade system have at times produced significantly less activity and therefore significantly less revenue than had been anticipated. And one of the thoughts about that is that the uncertainties about the cap and trade system and what it looks like and what its structure would be going forward would be secured in some fashion by the legislature reaffirming the cap and trade system, which would then assure the market that's essentially being created that the activity can go forward, and that would produce the activity and the revenues. So there's a number of reasons there that go into the cap and trade system and why the governor is seeking for the legislature to affirm the cap and trade system once again.
We have a question here about the state public pensions systems, and I wanted to know a little bit more. We touched on this briefly as part of Chris's remarks, but they wanted to understand a little bit more about the rationale for the what appears to be the increased state contribution for CalSTRS and CalPERS, whether indeed that is an increased allocation for this year, and just briefly sort of the rationale for that.
Yeah, so the one piece of this is essentially set because the overseers of CalPERS have actually voted and decided to reduce their expected rate of return from 7.5 to 7.0%. And that requires the state then to make additional contributions to meet the obligations that are built into the state's retirement system for its public employees. CalPERS and CalSTRS often move similarly in this regard, so the governor is expecting, he's built an assumption into his state budget that the overseers of CalSTRS will actually make a similar move to reduce their discount rate or their expected rate of return from 7.5 to 7.0%, and so there's $150+ million additional contribution that would be needed. Whether CalSTRS takes that action or not is one of the unknowns in the state budget, and the CalSTRS board will be taking that issue up in the weeks and months to come, and then that will most likely impact what the proposal looks like with the May revision. Behind all of that, this reduction in the rate of return, and I want to stress that the only thing going into the discount rate is not just the rate of return. There are a lot of factors around risk and the like that actually play in, but that's a sort of common way to understand it. One of the things that's going on behind the scenes is that for a long time, for several decades, retirement systems around the country have been assuming rates of return in this 7 to 8% range. And changes in the economy and changes in those rates in return over time are sort of showing a longer-term trend where that rate of return, which had been fairly typical, may not be typical anymore. And so what you're seeing is retirement systems around the country gradually taking that discount rate or that rate of return and reducing it by small amounts in order to try to deal with the trends that they're looking at going forward. And that means higher contributions from the general fund or the annual operating budget of the state governments that are overseeing those systems.
Thanks. We have a number of questions that have come in via GoToWebinar, but also another question that just came directly via email, so I want to get to that one. This one picks up on the issue of child care support. We talked about the fact that there's obviously a shortage for subsidized child care, and also Kristen talked a little bit about the what we're expecting from the feds. But this question asks about the pause that we talk about in the boost for child care spending, and it wants to know, like, is there any change in funding for this year? We talked about the pause in the multi-year plan for building back child care and boosting provider rates, but sort of at a top line level, Kristen, what is happening to child care spending in the budget this year?
So in the proposed budget for this next fiscal year, they annualize a lot of changes that were made in the 16-17 enacted budget. So those are some spending changes for sure. But the pause, that is the 5% to the provider payment rate that was to go in effect on July 1, 2017, and then the 3,000 slots, they're actually going to result in some cost savings to the state. I've jotted that down. That's about 105 million Prop 98 general fund, and then 121 million non-Prop 98 general fund.
And that's a good question, actually, about the sort of current service levels. So while we're talking about a state budget that doesn't make new investments, has paused some investments, there is sort of an assumption that prior years' kind of service levels are maintained in a lot of these systems going forward. In the early education arena, it's just that these planned additional investments are being delayed to a future year, depending on what happens with the state underlying revenue outlet.
And I would add that from 07-08 enacted to 16-17 enacted, when you adjust for inflation, we're still down about 700 million in funding overall, across all programs.
Okay, thanks. This is a question that I think any of a number of people could probably jump in on, but it's kind of a process question, and it's asking us to prognosticate a little bit. But the question is, if some of the worst expectations come true, and there's a repeal or a partial repeal or rollback of the ACA or other types of funding cuts, I mean, how do things move forward from here in terms of the state then stepping in and looking at what might be possible to actually, have a contingency plan or to sort of address some of those funding gaps? The question isn't really about specific numbers, but really about what then become the levers the state can use as part of this budget year to take on some of those potential funding gaps.
So I'll start here, and Scott, if you want to join in, that's great as well in terms of the ACA side of this. I think the first big question that comes up in terms of the ability to answer what's been posed there is when something happens in terms of the ACA repeal and replace or whatever that looks like. So if that were to happen very quickly, and say in the next few days and weeks, that might afford state leaders the opportunity to try and create some kind of systematic response in the months that they have ahead in terms of the state budget for 2017-18. If the process of doing whatever happens at the federal level takes a series of months or drifts into the April-May timeframe, for instance, it's going to butt right up against the May revision of the state budget and then the rapid creation and enactment of the state budget that happens from mid-May through the end of June. And so it may be much more difficult for state leaders to sort of craft that kind of comprehensive response they might want. So I think a lot of this has to do with what happens at the federal timing. I think one way or another, the sort of systematic, comprehensive response we might expect from state leaders is also something that's going to take some time to craft, and it might be something that we see some initial sort of incremental moves on in the deliberations about the 2017-18 state budget, and then something more at scale coming out this time next year. But that's really just conjecture and best guess at my end. Scott, do you have other thoughts?
Yeah, just to quickly add on, we often point out in our budget process work that the budget is a year-round process. That crafting the budget isn't just something that happens during the months of January through June. The legislature and governor always come back and give the budget another look in August. The governor is always looking at it behind the scenes. So in some ways, we're going to see playing out a very similar process. One difference this year might be they're going to come back in August and September, possibly grappling with some significant federal funding cuts that state leaders are going to have to figure out how to address, whether they try to fill those gaps with state revenues or look for some other solution, perhaps cobbling something together that gets us through the next fiscal year so that they can take a deeper look at what needs to happen.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Scott. So we did say earlier we tried to get everybody out, off the webinar and finished and wrap by about 2 at an hour, and we've hit a little bit past that. So I think we are going to keep to that and begin to wrap up. I do want to just quickly thank everybody for the questions. We had a couple dozen questions. We tried to get to as many as we can, so thanks for the great questions that allow us to go a little bit deeper on the budget proposal. We will, be looking at those questions. They will help inform our analyses going forward. So I encourage you to keep an eye on our California Budget Bites blog, and of course our website. You see the URL up here on the screen, calbudgetcenter.org. Also follow us on Twitter at Cal Budget Center, and of course on Facebook as well. We appreciate you attending today and your continued interest in the role of budget and policy choices in California and broadening prosperity. And just as a quick reminder, we will be sending out an email in the next day or so with a link to a page with the slide deck and also with a video recording of the webinar. So with this, this again is Stephen Bliss with the California Budget Center. I want to thank all our panelists today. And again, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to hearing from you and continue to work with you during this budget season. Thank you again.